Today on the Dolby Institute Podcast, we're talking Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. Recently, I had the amazing privilege of going to Rome for the world premiere of the movie, and while I was there, I got to sit down for a few minutes and talk with the film's director, Christopher McQuarry, and the producer and star himself, Tom Cruise. Here's what they had to say about the sound of this film.
The sound design to me, editing to me, all has a musicality, all has a rhythm. And what Dolby Atmos allows us to do is make that much more immersive. I have that many more channels that I can be planting sounds in a way that just makes it completely immersive, that you won't hear any other way.
We've been working together now 16 years. And to be able to read one of his screenplays, it's like music. The editing, like someone to understand how to tell that story through sound. Not just visually, but through sound.
Yes.
And understand that kind of rhythm. It was there in the script.
Looks like we lost them.
There's things you get to do where you can put on the sides, you have people driving over you. And even with the train, it's just you have that where you're there. You're inside that train car with us. It's giving you not just objectively watching it, but getting a subjective feeling of being with those characters.
On the podcast today, we're joined by the movie's picture editor, Eddie Hamilton, as well as the supervising sound editor, James Mather, and the movie's re-recording mixer, Chris Burdon. Now, the last time that Chris and James were on this podcast, they were here to talk about Top Gun: Maverick, that other Tom Cruise movie for which they won the Academy Award for Best Sound. So the expectations are pretty high going into this new Mission Impossible movie. Let's hear about the track. I want to start just by asking, this is a massive film made on a massive scale, big action sequences. The plot is complex. There are a lot of great characters. It's a long movie. What is it, 2:45 thereabouts? And it's also
2:36 without credits. Which,
2:36.
As the editor, when I've been trying to shave precious seconds off the running time, like for the previous year, I'm very conscious of where we ended up. Thank heavens. Movie started off much longer, as it always does.
But Eddie, when you and I had a few minutes to chat in Rome, one of the things I said to you was that I didn't feel the length of it. Now I've seen it 3 times. It plays honestly. There's some 90-minute movies that have felt longer to me than your movie. So I just wanted to start off by asking you guys your approach, both for picture editing but also for sound. How do you give the audience that much of a huge thrill ride, but also let them breathe and not get them exhausted? How do you pace them through something like this?
We're very conscious of the audience's reaction from the first minute to the last minute. And when Chris and Tom and I are watching the movie with friends and family or with a cold test audience, we are extremely conscious of how everybody is reacting to every micro emotional beat through the film. And we listen very carefully to what the audience tells us about where the film is too long, and we confront it constantly. We want to make mass entertainment. We want it to appeal to as many people as possible. We lean into the testing process. We lean into screenings, and we never settle. And we never settle for anything that's less than outstanding if we can. And if the audience is telling us that something's too long, we just keep cutting it and compressing it and looking at every single frame. The 2 places where we kept getting notes were mostly the Rome car chase and then the train at the end, and how long we were away from Ethan on the train, but also the very end of the scene where Ethan and Grace are running up through the train cars. And we just kept trimming it and trimming it. We are very conscious of action fatigue. Although the interesting thing is when we're editing, we work almost totally silent, because in a way, average sound is worse than no sound sometimes. If you're screening a film, if you just tell the audience that it's very rough. Like our first friends and family screening was nearly 4 hours long in October 2022, and we had very little sound on it, and so it played very dry, no music, just dialogue. And we kind of watched 2.5 hours and then took a break and then watched another hour and a half with like 50 people who were all warned about this in advance. But that's the process that McHugh likes to embrace. And he knows that if it works visually with no sound, it's only going to improve dramatically with sound and music. But we don't settle until it's as good as it can possibly be. And James's team and poor Chris and Mark Taylor, the other mixer, will tell you that the amount of conforming they had to do, sometimes quite late in the process, because I was shredding the timeline because we really did want every single frame to earn its place in the film. But in terms of pacing out like the roller coaster of action, we're very conscious of action fatigue. McHugh's very conscious of where he uses music and where he leans on sound effects. And I'll let James and Chris kind of talk about that a bit more.
So there was obviously this production spanned a very large period of time as well. So there was a lot of intense work, and then sound-wise, we stood back a bit while the picture carried on shooting, and that allowed us to have a bit of perspective that you don't normally have, which was a luxury, I think, for us. But it didn't actually make much of a difference towards the end of the process, as Eddie said, when all the different screws and bolts became tighter and tighter and tighter. And in many cases, things that we were very familiar with, almost over familiar with, needed rebuilding pretty much from scratch. The Desert Storm scene, we took apart and realized that once you start changing the shape of the sound within a scene, it changes its character, and sometimes irreversibly. You can't have the dynamic impact that McHugh was after, and by using the same material, just reduced or just conformed in a way that fits the cut. So it was a learning experience, because I don't think I've conformed as much to a point where you then just say, well, we've got to start again. We know the sounds that we've got work, but the structure and the shape of it is a different beast now. There are things in there that gave us a lull, where a swing would rattle as somebody ran past. That's no longer in there. So the rhythm of that whole section has to change. And the dynamics, I would say there are 2 or 3 scenes, big scenes, that changed hugely towards the latter stage of the dub. Strangely, the car chase scene, there were a few elements of content that we shifted around, but ultimately that just tightened, but it stayed very much within the realm of where we had started, which was one of the first scenes we really sort of dug into.
From our point of view, and from the mixing point of view, being on it for a relatively shorter period of time compared to Eddie and then sound editorial, you're aware of immediately, even though things were changing and being edited and the runtime was changing, we were aware where the big action sequences were. So you get these kind of very strong structural points that are going to be hit dramatically. But because things were still changing with the rhythm of the film and how the dialogue scenes were interspersed amongst this, it was actually, compared to the previous, like Top Gun and maybe Fallout to a different extent, I wasn't on it for such a long time. It kind of evolved, and everybody in the room just gave opinions to, and we also had the friends and family screenings quite late in the whole schedule. We just responded a bit more on this one to how to get that dynamic. When there's a dialogue, a nice expositional dialogue scene, we were able to know that we weren't going to push maybe a thematic, a music score too strongly behind that, knowing what's coming up. You've got that space. So you've got a dynamic space sound wise. And then as long as you then hit the next, as I said, these big structural, wonderful action sequences, then you get the build into them. That's what you're trying to achieve. So there was a bit more of a sort of evolution, but a rapid evolution of certain things. As James said, we're reassessing quite a lot. And it felt quite dynamic at the end. The last few weeks of the mix really sort of informed that, and luckily, you need a bit of experience and luck and everything combined, and you watch it and you hope the audience feels that the runtime is good and all those things. So yeah.
Interestingly, the film was too loud at some points, and certainly towards the end of the mix, we all got quite used to the intensity of the track. And we took it out, and we were screening it for people. We were screening it, and Tom came back and said, "Guys, I think this is actually too intense in terms of sound pressure." consistent sound pressure at the end of the movie. And there was a point where we kind of took everything down to a 3 dB because it was actually, we were just oversensitized or desensitized to it, I should say. But when you've got a big third act, like that scene on the train, you are so conscious of battering people's eardrums. You know, it's and even though you're aware of it, you still make the mistake of thinking this isn't loud enough, you know, because you've been sat in the room for 6 or 7 hours. But Tom was the one who had the objectivity, and he would quite often go, guys, I think this is actually punishingly loud. And because we were streaming the mix to his personal theater in Florida, we were kind of doing a live, what was the technology we used, guys?
Streambox.
Streambox, yeah. We used a thing called Streambox, which would send the mix down to Tom so he could react in his calibrated theater at the other end. So he had the objectivity, and he approves everything on these films. So that's kind of how we ended up. But in terms of the pace, we just didn't give up until the movie absolutely was a rocket ride. You know, the initial sequence on the submarine, for example, started out as a suspense sequence and ended up being much more of a kind of action sequence, quite frankly. You know, the moment it all kicks off, it's just foot on the floor, go, 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 go in the submarine. And there was a lot more suspense originally, but we had a very long movie, and the art of film editing with a long movie is compressing the maximum amount of story into the minimum amount of screen time. So by the end, McHugh and I were going through each reel of the movie, and we were going, I think we've managed to get 12 seconds out of this 20-minute reel, and we would be high-fiving ourselves going, great, 12 seconds, yay. And then you think, right, well, so if we do 12 seconds in like all the reels, that'll give us like 1 minute and 10 seconds shorter, and yay, that's where we were, and where any editing cutting room is at the end of a long film. You're really looking at every frame and every emotional nuance and every beat and every angle and going, will the scene work if we take this out? Do we need this? You know, but everything that's in there we do need, because we tested every combination of stuff being in and out, you know.
I appreciate you saying that, Eddie. Now that I've seen the film 3 times, like I'm starting to clue into but even like little things like when Paris gets on the train and takes out the conductor, right? You know, that sequence when she gets on, like I realize there's not a spare frame in there. Like you told that story of her taking over that with the bare minimum number of frames you needed to get that point across. And I think it's just masterful.
And yet we keep the characterization when she draws the little heart on the window, and, you know, which is just pure Pom Clemente character. So we want to make sure that the audience is given those little grace notes. We don't want to get rid of those, because otherwise the film becomes just information. And, you know, McHugh has this saying that information is the death of emotion. And we literally want to have we want the audience to have a purely emotional experience from the beginning of the movie to the end, so that everything is served up. So they don't have to work to understand the movie. We're giving them what they need to see and hear exactly when they need to see and hear it, in order to make it like an effortless, smooth viewing experience, which is really the holy grail when you're making a film.
Yeah. Well, you guys have teed up so much of the stuff that I want to talk about in your response to that first question. But so I was going to get into this later, but since you brought it up, I want to talk a little bit about, I think people are kind of curious about Tom Cruise's involvement in the editorial and the mix of the film. Obviously, he's the producer. It says right up there at the like 2 of the first head credits are a Tom Cruise production, Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. So, and then Eddie, I know when we were talking in Rome, you told me that Tom has Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos in his home theater in Florida. And you just said that that's where he was monitoring a lot of this stuff. So tell me about his involvement, how he works with McHugh during the sound mix and during the editorial process.
He is involved very intimately. Initially, when McHugh and I are sketching an assembly of the movie together, which evolves dramatically as is the process with these films, because even what we start out with, what we think the film is going to be, it always evolves into something maybe quite different later on down the line. Once we've done a first pass that McHugh is happy with, he will show it to Tom. So Tom doesn't really watch us edit like in the room. We will show him stuff. So he has objectivity. he also has final cut on this movie, and he approves every shot of the movie. He improves every cut, every visual effect, every sound effect, every music cue, and all the color from beginning to end. And his experience is valuable. You know, he's been making movies for 40 years and he knows what he's doing. And we are very fortunate to have him as a terrific hands-on producer. You know, we have a committee of one, is what we say when we make these films. And so later in the process, when he's given us editorial notes, McHugh and I are revising the edit. He will call the cutting room every afternoon, or at least once a day, but usually it's sort of in the afternoon. And McHugh will talk to him and update him on everything that we've done. When we move into music, that it's the same. He will approve the music cues. And then when we're in the sound mix, you know, he'll start hearing sounds because James's team will be giving us sounds and we'll be loading into the Media Composer timeline. And he will hear the temp mixes as well. Like for the first temp mix, he was there, right, guys, in the room with us, if I remember.
Yeah, and he's got a very, as you know, Eddie, he's very passionate and he has a very strong opinion about the way. I mean, I remember this from the airplane takeoff in Fallout.
Rogue Nation.
Rogue Nation, sorry.
Yeah.
Rogue Nation. When, you know, you're sitting in a room with the man who is on the screen hanging onto a plane. You don't normally get the stunt man in the theatre at a mix giving you notes about the intensity of how it felt. So with all these films, Tom's input is so visceral to what you're seeing because he was there. And often we will emphasize an action scene, the fight in the alley scene, for example, with Pom, and we'd done it was a little bit too clean, a little bit too crisp, a little bit too percussive in a way, and Tom came in while we were doing that scene. We said, let's come and have a look, and you know, pulled it apart, guys. You know, it's too much this, it's too much that. It's not a martial arts movie. It's a this. I want to feel it, and this is the mantra that we hear and follow. This is the mantra that the soundtrack has to abide by, which is feel it. And if putting in the production sound, which gives away some of the set textures and the hollowness of the, you know, where they were, and it's a bit dirty and a bit grubby and a bit scuffy, if that is what makes the feeling work, then that goes in. And actually, you know, a lot of times that perspective is missed because we weren't there at the time when it was being done, and his involvement and his remembering of that. And he wants the audience to feel what he felt at that time. That's an extraordinary insight for the sound department to have that experience and that objectivity that he brings to every part of it. Every stage of the sound that we do is he will go, I don't get it, I don't feel it, or it's fantastic, don't touch it, you know. But he's very, very, very committed. Once he digs in, there's a lot to do. There's a lot to get right. And actually it makes it feel like you've got a mountain to climb, but quite often it's only 3 or 4 tweaks and a bit of something else added in and you're there. So it's that, I'm sure Eddie knows this. It's that understanding when somebody's giving you, it's not understanding the intent of the notes and the direction they want to go, and not feeling like you've done it wrong and not feeling like you're miles away from where it should be. It's understanding that the passion involved in getting it that 2% right, 2% can take half a day, but it's worth it because when you listen back to it, it's like, I'm there. I'm totally there. I'm not, you know, I'm drawn in. And this is what Eddie and McHugh and Tom spend so much time creating with the picture that we have to make sure we don't stamp all over it and try and make it into a massive action sound. It's got to be the real sound in a massive action movie, and that's why that's the challenge.
And just it's quite interesting because it's not a sort of simplistic approach to getting the sound of how location felt at the time. It's a combination of how it felt at the time, how it needs to feel in the movie, and then just start to experiment and get there. You know, the wonderful major stunt motorbike off the cliff edge. Tom felt very strongly about the feel of when he's then plummeting through the air and wanted to capture that. And it was quite interesting. It was is something that you could over exaggerate or hold back on or play with different textures and so on. And we got there quite quickly on that. And he went, that's how I want it to feel. And that's how it feels to skydive. And as I said, there's a sophistication to it because it can't just be, if someone's been in a stunt car, a car doing the stunts, getting the exact sonic moment that it sounded like at the time. It's something quite layered, and a version of that we're trying to create for McHugh, Eddie, and Tom. So,
yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, because one of the things, and I remember talking with, I had the chance to talk with Tom about Top Gun as well, and I felt the same way about this, and we had the chance to talk about it. It's like, I feel like the work that you guys do on sound is so much about giving the audience the subjective experience that the characters are having, right? And it's not about necessarily replicating what that location sounded, but as you said so well, you're using sound in a very specific way to put the audience in the kind of the emotional situation that the characters are in.
100%.
Yeah. And that actually, I feel like dovetailing on that, a lot of what you're doing is almost subtractive, Eddie. It's the same thing that you were doing with the picture, which is like getting it down to the bare minimum. One of the things that did stand out for me now viewing the film a third time, and I saw online some chatter in the film sound nerd community about this over the weekend. Let's talk about the big airport, that kind of that cat and mouse game in the airport. It's a big sequence, a lot of characters, marble floors. There's almost no Foley footsteps in that sequence. So I'm really curious.
Yeah.
It's a very specific approach that some of the film sound nerd people have called out, and I'm curious to hear sort of like the evolution of that treatment of those sequences. I feel like, talking specifically about Foley, you guys were very specific in the way you used Foley, and it appears exactly what it needs to. And it's much more specific than in a typical action movie of this scale.
Yeah, James, over to you on this one. There was a full Foley track, of course, but I'm going to let James talk to the mantra that we were given. It was actually a very simple guideline and rule that we followed. But I'll let James talk about it.
It's funny, Eddie. You say it is a guideline, and it's many of the guidelines, Foley especially, but in other places as well, where we don't need it. If I'm listening to a guy's feet while he's walking, I'm not watching what he's doing and aware of who he is and how he's feeling. I don't hear my own feet when I walk. I just don't. It's not my thing. That's Tom's line. I don't hear my feet when I walk. So it's that. Okay, it's all about the perspective of the character that we're focusing on. If you hear everybody's feet, you don't hear that one person. And if you let the music take it, the feet it's all about timing. They get in the way. There are times when they're really essential. When Benji's running down the metal steps, they do so much. They really help that whole location. They help. He's on his own. And there are moments when it's really important. And I think as sound technicians and creatives, we like to over embellish a picture. That is our mode 2. Like, it's security rope. It's the thing that we have. We've got Foley coverage. We can use it for whatever. We've got, high pitched squeals for the cars. We've got glass smashes. And this process, more so than others, I think, mainly because of the duration, possibly. There was a lot of stuff going in. This process was, the last weeks were out, take out, try without. Let's not have that. Let's have that instead. Simplify, so that the dynamic range becomes greater and more impactful and more deliberate. And it's not just, there's not this footstep track wallowing around that you occasionally hear and don't hear. If you can't hear it because of the other sounds, get rid of it. Let the other sounds have that little bit of space that Foley might be taking up. And the percussion in this soundtrack is incredible. So Foley will compete with that. No matter how small, it could be like a rim shot is the sound of somebody putting a bag down. And we just get rid. And it's a great discipline to embrace, because it's all about confidence. It's all about having the confidence to not lean in on things that you know are your sort of standard tiers of soundtrack. And it's much more exciting. It's like we we have a day of culling, and the poor Mark, in this instance with the Foley, poor Mark's there having pre-mixed it all, and he's just like, all right. I mean, he's making it very clear that everyone can see that the finger is on the fader and it's down to 0. There is nothing
it down
all the way through the reel. Okay, is that better? Yes, that's better for now. We may need more, but then it means that people can say, "I'd like to hear the feet there," rather than, I mean, then it's in production. So then we go, okay, we need to strip out some of the production. Is it tied to the dialogue? That might be a bit of an issue. We don't want to lose the performance. So, but I think it's a very good discipline. It's a hard one, but it's well worth exercising.
We're attempting to get this perfect version where you're connecting with the characters. But clearly, if we've got a situation where someone looks like they're floating through a scene and something doesn't feel quite right, we haven't grasped that scene correctly sonically and so on. So there's a bit of a mantra, and there's stylistic things between filmmakers, and this is a definite style that we go for, and in terms of keeping connection, simplifying things, and it's quite interesting to do it. As I said, we make sure we don't leave any versions of it that that an audience would go, oh look, I really need to be grounded by something going on sonically. Yeah.
There's also, Chris, you want to talk a little bit about the harshness, because Tom was responding to the harshness of the glass and the harshness of the car squeals. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because that's something we really culled, and you were EQing very precisely to make sure that the audience's ears weren't kind of grating too much.
Yeah, I mean, that was Mark's work, of course. But again, it was a little bit in terms of the car chase sequences and the early impacts and so on, Tom recognized in terms of what he wanted to achieve from that sequence sonically was that the brighter, brasher sounds, edgier sounds were not quite conveying what he wanted. He wanted the impact to be lower, EQ-wise, frequency-wise, and to actually to produce the same impact that typically if you see on scene a bit more glass and a bit more metal. The higher frequencies, again, we really played with, and it was, as I said, it was Mark's work to just refine that. And I mean, Glenn, you already mentioned that the low end in this film is something that we worked a lot on, and McHugh is particularly keen on, and Tom enjoys, and we all enjoy, getting the best low end. And as a music mixer, I'm also doing the same thing musically, trying to get the richness in the score. So that plays into this. Let's get rid of edgy elements, or if we have to have, and if we need them, sonically, we want to have them. Be careful with them,
Since you brought up the score, Chris, and one of the things I definitely wanted to talk with you guys about is the collaboration between the sound effects and the sound design and the score on the film. I think, one of the things I really loved about the mix is, and I think, Eddie, you brought this up earlier. I feel like you guys and McHugh, you pick very specific moments when the score is going to lead as opposed to the sound effects. I'm thinking about the chase sequence in Venice where, Ethan is racing to Gabriel and this big fight that's happening. And I felt like, a large portion of that sequence.
No footsteps in that.
You almost took everything out and just pushed the score forward.
Yeah.
And I love that, in contrast to other sequences that are more effects heavy. Talk to me about, and maybe Eddie, you can start us about the conversations, with the composer Lorne Balfe, and how you make those decisions about kind of where you're going to lean in on score and sound effects and how you balance those pieces.
McHugh is intimately involved in every nuance of the film. He will go through, we'll work on the dialogue selection of the takes, and we'll dive in and swap out syllables and lines and cheat things in people's mouths, whatever it is that we need to do. But we don't take any shortcuts. We're super thorough about that. And when we're working on action scenes, like I said, we work totally silent and make sure that it's going to work 100% visually. Bearing in mind, probably over half the audience for this movie does not have English as their first language, so it has to work visually ultimately, and I think it does. And McHugh is aware that the extra dimensions of sound and music, sound effects and music, will enhance it. And then when he's working on the score, he will turn off the dialogue and turn off the sound effects and just focus on the score. And he will make sure that the score is working emotionally perfectly. And he's constantly, we're constantly confronting every moment in the movie and trying stuff out and leaning into ideas and discovering new themes and motifs and new orchestration. Like one thing that came quite late was the very tight percussion which comes in from the top secret drumming corps in Switzerland, which when Lorne discovered, that was a very cool new texture percussion wise, that took over in a way from the bongos from Fallout. And so the score evolves very, very delicately and precisely over months and months of work. And McHugh won't put a cue in the movie unless he really likes it. So even on our previews, there was quite a lot of stuff where there was no score, which actually contributed to our discoveries in the mix, where he was like, this played better with no score in that second preview that we did, and things like that. Which is why actually there is from the moment that Gabriel falls off the train, there is actually no score in the movie through the whole rest of the sequence until right near the end, when after the grand piano has fallen down, So, but he is, he knows that you can't have, your cake and eat it sonically, because it just becomes a mess. And so we do pick our moments like that. And Ethan running through Venice is a purely emotional experience for the audience at that point. The music is telling you that this fight is not going to end well. There's a tragic tonality to the music, which we only discovered quite late in the process. And the cue is obviously building to some kind of climax as well, which as the audience is watching, they don't want that sad inevitability to the fight, because it's, the entity, the villain of the movie, has kind of foreseen these events. And so Ethan's been warned that one of these two people is going to die. And so the audience is like, oh my God, what's going to happen?
And we're invested. We don't want either one of those two people to die.
No. It's a very tough scene emotionally for people to watch. Very, very emotional. Even for people who have never seen Rogue Nation or Fallout, they're still very moved at that moment in the film. But Tom was like, no footsteps, just music. We had it all there, and we ended up choosing a very emotional path. And we're very sensitive to that, and we don't get it right first time. We're always experimenting. One of the things I will say, one of the things I loved about this process is that James's team was obviously on with me for like maybe 2 years or something. And Chris and Mark were the mixers on our first temp mix and our second temp mix and our third temp mix and our final mix. So they were fully invested emotionally in the evolution of the mix, which I absolutely love. It's an enormous luxury, quite frankly. And I would take their 5/1 stems from each mix and load them into the Media Composer timeline. And they would be live as we would then refine the edit. And so I would constantly have the most recent version of the mix in the Media Composer, which is just the most sublime way to work, because what I would do is I would make tiny changes to the mix, to the automation, for example. And then I would put markers on my timeline, and I would write a note to say, I've turned this line down 3 dB, or I've removed these sound effects, or Tom asked me to do this, or McHugh asked. So when they get the next turnover, they get a list of all the markers of all the things that I've changed. And then they are aware of the creative decisions that have been discussed in the cutting room, where they're not present. But we can evolve the mix very accurately then. And I just love that way of working when you have the same team involved and invested all the way through. It means that you are working, you're collaborating very directly together for months, which results in a much kind of more intimate mixing process, I think.
Little detail in amongst the Venice sequence, which again, on the face of it, just has this incredible symphonic, this beautiful music, like some Bach, or whatever, it's got this grandeur at the end. It was quite interesting because we knew, and it evolved slightly, but we knew it was going to be music mainly, if not 100% music at certain points. But the sort of balletic quality of the fighting that was going on underneath this music, it was actually quite experimental and retaining just enough of the sounds of Grace's fight and Ilsa's fight without going mute too early on that, because we had to really experiment how we got there. Tom's running actually was mute, and then we were totally in his head, but we needed to retain the sort of the important remnants of the important aspects of the fighting and how poignant and important that was. But again, to have this balletic nature, so that taking those sounds and backing them off slowly was really quite an interesting, subtle bit of mixing effects wise, because you've got the potential of all the hits and the impacts and the metal clangs of there's a violence, but a kind of beauty to it. And so that was just needed to be slowly backed off to allow for the final, as I said, kind of wonderful, this over the top shot looking down on the canal and the fights, to allow that to really pay off.
Let's talk about the Rome car chase sequence. Look, we could spend an hour just talking about that, I'm sure. It's a great set piece for the film, and just unbelievably great sound design. There were a couple of key moments within that sequence, though, that stood out for me that I wanted to ask you about. And one of them is, that it's pretty early on in the sequence when Grace crashes the stolen police car into Paris's, is it a Hummer at that point, or
it's
a Range Rover?
I think it's a Range Rover, yeah.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting moment in the track. And so, James, can you just kind of talk us through kind of how that sequence came together? Did it evolve, and how you approach the sound for that particular sequence? Because honestly, you crash a lot of cars in the Rome sequence, and the car crashes all sound amazing to me. They just have impact and weight, and they sound fantastic.
Well, that particular note is a Tom note. He'll watch the scene and he'll say, I don't want to hear the glass smash when a car hits a car. I don't want to hear the twang. I want to hear Pam, Pam. And we're walking around going, is it Pam? Is it good? And it's like this person in the room called Pam that has to be the sound. The scooters, Pam! And it's like he has this explosive way of describing how he wants sounds to be. And he doesn't want the top end, as we've discussed before. He wants to save that for other things. So he wants the impact to be as visceral and as physical as possible. And in the scene where Grace is caught unexpectedly while she's talking to Ethan in the car and she gets smashed into, there's a long way to go in that reel. There's a lot of noise to come. And so it was very much a case of, this is a lightning moment. This is a lightning strike, as we've done before in other films with them, where you have a big impact and then you've got the opportunity to really strip it down. And again, we had heartbeats, we had tonality, we had the steering wheel beeping seatbelt sound going through kind of filters swimming around her head. The best thing that was nothing, or virtually nothing, and her breathing, so that we stayed with Grace, so that we were in her state of shock, so that we were seeing and hearing as she was, everything muted until the moment where his head comes through and we use the bright sound of glass. But it's stealing the opportunities of less to make more later on, the smashing into the scooters. was a sound that they really wanted to feature as a big sound.
I mean, we simplified even the breathing, Grace's breathing in the car, because it was already stripped back, but I'd put a little bit of delay and stuff that I thought was quite fancy and nice. It just created a kind of weirdness to her head space that she's absolutely discombobulated. But again, we just pulled back on that. And one of my favorite moments is actually sonically in the film is the muted sound of the motorbike that appears out of the right side. And that's all set up by the space dynamically created earlier.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because every time I've seen the film 3 times, every time the audience has had a huge reaction, because, but it's interesting, like they shot that sequence that particular shot in a very interesting way to set you guys up for success, because, we're in the car with Grace. Tom Cruise sends his motorbike to take the guys out, but it's out of focus in the background. Yeah, it's just enough focus that we can see it, but you guys also don't play the sound on it. So the audience, every time I've seen it, has a very loud kind of reaction to it, which you guys actually enable by not having a lot of sound in the theater. So the audience actually gets to participate in that moment.
Yeah, it's true. There are so many layers of it that allow the soundtrack to be immersive and, narrative and inclusive. That's the key thing is like you said, it's you're not just ramming it down everyone's ears.
I think one of the things that I'm always impressed by in the Mission Impossible movies is the sense of humor and the moments that are taken for comic levity. And I think one of my favorite ones is the Fiat. It's a visual sight gag, but you guys also make it into a very funny sonic sight gag as well. This little indiscriminate, nondescript looking Fiat that sounds like it has a rocket engine inside it. So tell me about the sound design of the Fiat. Surely that is not a car that exists in the real world. So how did you approach creating that?
So the Fiat actually does exist. They took a Tesla motor and inserted it into a Cinquecento. And the best sounds we got from that Fiat were the doors and the creaks because those cars are pretty tinny. And actually that counterpoint to the tech whiz and hum of the engine was what made it the character it was, I think, because if it had all been souped up, solid doors and everything, the fact that everything was a little bit tinny and a little bit, you didn't trust the body of it to last. But the engine sounded, like you said, it sounded like a rocket. We used a variety of sounds. We recorded the real car, but that was mainly physicality. And then I went out and bought a clutch of electric skateboards that we could mic up with contact mics and all various different types of styles of recording it. And we had, because it has a remote control, these skateboards have a remote control that you can accelerate and decelerate. It gave us the opportunity to be much more descriptive about how we wanted it to run. But there is really go, stop, and everything in between, and that's it. There's no. So then one of the designers would then go into doing a pitch bend pass and take the same track but do pitch bends on it as well for turning corners. We relied heavily on skidding, and then when we were asked to remove all the high end skids, we had to rack our brains to think, what would it do if it wasn't skidding? So the engine, McQuarry would say, it's really weird. It's like the Fiat's donutting all around the square. And he's going, it's just weird because I expect to hear a car engine. But of course we can't hear a car engine because there's no, so you only really get to hear the electric element of it on the real close-ups, which leaves a lot more space for dialogue, for humor, their relationship. I mean, Chris worked a lot on getting extra bits and pieces and the timing of the lines from Grace and Ethan. Their double act through that chase is priceless. It's from the moment he crashes and she reassures him right the way through to the very end when he's in the train, in the station. It's genius. So they wanted to milk that a bit more, and that sonic range allowed us to do that. Pom doesn't say anything, so her truck can be as big and as loud as we want it to be. But for them, it was a useful it was a useful dynamic for us to have the dialogues work with it as well.
And again, just within the whole sequence with the Fiat, there were still moments where we wanted maybe to have acceleration and some more dynamic. And of course, the inherent sound didn't have the growl of a petrol, diesel engine, whatever. So we'd use other elements just to build that. It could be the chasing car, or it could be the sound of the street. So we had a few beats that we made sure we could still accelerate, push through, and just start get the dynamic the way we wanted. So that's quite interesting when you've got a palette that's slightly inherently underpowered, because that's the whole gag and the whole idea.
Yeah, James, you mentioned the skids, and that was definitely an element of this car chase sequence that I wanted to discuss with you guys about, because I think I saw in a BTS, a feature at some point, McHugh talking about shooting the car chase sequence in Rome, which was all shot practically on the streets in Rome during a COVID lockdown, amazingly. And one of the things he says in that is the cobblestone, the stone streets made it very difficult to control and predict exactly how cars, and especially motorcycles, were going to behave, in skid outs and kind of a high speed chase. And I thought that, the sound effects that you guys came up with to communicate the cars moving on cobblestones were just fantastic. You're probably going to tell me now that was all production. I hope you're not going to tell me that was all production.
No, we went to Paris. Funnily enough, we actually ended up in Paris to record them for one of the previous missions. And we fell in love with the sounds of tires on cobblestones. They're like, from being close to the pavement to being on the wide angle, big squares. They just have every car sounds slightly different. So we had a really poor recording session where we were supposed to get all sorts of things. We got about 5 hours of cars on cobblestones, bikes on cobblestones, cyclists. It's a terrific sound. It's a really helpful sound to be able to fall back on. If you want to make space for other things, you can keep that. And that, like Chris was saying, the perspective of cars coming in from rear left and onto screen, you could make that impact with cobblestone sounds, with tires on cobblestones, and really beef them up. Mark had a lot of fun getting the best frequency dependent on which cars and where they were. Just another texture, really, just a texture that brings you down to road level instead of being up on top of the car or inside it. You're there, you're down there with them.
One of the things that I was really impressed by, obviously the Venice sequence is a huge set piece as well, the big gala, and there's a lot to talk about. But I wanted to ask you specifically about the approach to the sound design of the entity. The entity is obviously our big bad in this movie, the AI presence. I mean, what was your approach to the kind of the conundrum of how do you personify an AI and make it feel ominous? I felt like the sound design of the entity was very clever. So James, can you tell us about the development of that and how you approached it? And
it was a fortuitous find. We weren't going originally. The entity, we did a family and friends screening. I think there were 2 cues in the entire film. It was all sound effects, and the feeling was that the music was going to be carrying the entity storyline through, and we got to another screening, and Edgar Wright was in the audience, and I think Edgar said to McHugh, I think I miss the entity not having a specific sound, an identity sound. Anyway, that was happening on one side, and on our side we were muddling around with sounds and trying things, not really thinking about the entity. I got home one evening, and my one of my daughters said, Dad, can you go and sort the telly out? I can't, it's not playing sound properly and I can't hear and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. It's what happens when you're a sound person. Everybody comes to you to fix the speakers. So I went in, and there was a sound bar in front of the TV, and what it was doing was this, like a digital breakout. And I was like, well, I don't know how I'd make that sound. I don't know what plugins or what kind of modulation I'd use. That's really interesting. And also, it's a genuine mistake. This isn't a sound that this soundbar company ever wanted sound bars to play. So I thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll put up Rogue Nation and I'll play the title scene, and then I'll skip through and play a few sections of the movie through it. So at least it's owned by Paramount. And then that was it. And I had it on my phone. I'd recorded it on my phone. So it was just a chance. And so when the conversation came about a year and a half later, the entity ought to have a sound. I was in the cutting room with McHugh and I said, well, how about this? And I played it to him and he went, that's interesting. That's brilliant. So we then went full steam, and Chris was, it was a very good collaboration between sound design and dialogues, because it within the entity sound, which I only had a minute's worth, and it features a lot more than a minute in the movie. So Chris would then work with the dialogues to try and make sure that we had, like we talked about trying to have lines from elsewhere in the film so that the entity is repeating lines that we know we've heard, but it was too complicated. So we worked out a way of replicating the basic modulation effect and the distortion of it so that we could do there was a scene where Benji then becomes the entity while they're running through Venice. And that was a real collaboration where what I had recorded wasn't going to be useful enough for that. Chris had to work on the dialogue, Benji's voice dialogue, to get it so that it started sounding more entity-like. And we used the entity recording to underplay that so that you always had this reminder. There's a bit in the submarine as well where you see a little bit of the entity screen on the sonar, which is a real little Easter egg thing, and you get a little bit of entity coming in there, and it became a huge deal. This sound that was originally not meant to ever exist suddenly had a character part in the film, which was exciting. I love it when, I don't know, I don't want to call it a mistake, but a chance becomes an opportunity.
I think the evolution of this again pays testament to the focus and desire to improve this film right until the last time we print master and it's put onto DCP and leaves the studio. This evolved in the last 4 or 5 weeks of the process. McHugh's willingness to be receptive to, the Edgar Wright story is great. He's mentioned that in the press, that the entity should have a presence that he had not been sure it needed, and felt that music could do it. We were going to maybe increase low end and really use the sub to give this entity. So it would be much slightly vague but ominous, and it would have a presence. But this approach, and then being able to weave this throughout the film, and if you stay through the credits, there's an extra few frames, and we haven't seen the next one, but that what life this is going to have into the future. It really was the way it evolved, and this intensity to make sure we've got the best story being told.
I know you guys have been so generous with your time. I do have another couple of questions because we haven't even gotten to the third act yet. I do want to talk with you about the Orient Express sequence, and of course, one of the things that I love about the track is that you guys really use dynamic range. I feel like you use quiet moments very impressively and very strategically as well. One of the things that really struck me, and I heard McHugh talk about this. When Ethan does the cliff jump and, dives off the side of the cliff with the motorcycle, you guys go very quiet in that moment right after he goes off of the edge. And again, each time I'm with the audience, I now when that happens and you guys go quiet with the track, I become very aware of the audience around me and everybody's reaction to this moment. And you guys, it was a very interesting decision for you guys to create room for that, which I thought was just fantastic.
Yeah, it's a luxury to have that, be pushed in that direction. And what you can hear is this very tiny, high-pitched sound of the wind through the wheels of the bike, which is giving you that sort of fading away sound. So it's leading you, and there's a little bit of flap from Ethan's clip. I mean, just enough so that you know there is something there, but that's keeping the audience pulled in, so that when that cut that Chris mentioned earlier hits the audience, it's a real impact. I mean, you can feel it off the screen. It's huge. They do.
Yeah, the build up. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Well, they do cut it with all this. They have this all in their minds as they're making the movie. They are always thinking about, how are we going to make this pop? How are we going to bring the audience in, to then push them out, to then bring them back in? And they've got this sort of very, very cool approach to sound, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know, if it's like some kind of boxing match where you set up your opponent and so on to then hit them really hard, because the lead up to that has the wonderful comedy on the edge of the cliff with Benji and Ethan. So that moment inherently has got a nice subtlety, and that you don't need to be dynamically. That gives you a nice space, and then you're in and out of the carriage, I think, subsequently, and then there's the close up of Tom revving the bike and the foot on the pedal and all that, and you have to make a decision there how grand you're going to make the music cue, because you still want to have the build to the master moment off the edge. So you're setting it all up, and some of it's, if you're lucky, it's intuitive and it evolves, and other times you just watch it again and you watch it again, and you've seen it a week ago and you watch that reel again and you go, we can push that a bit more, we can use the brass, we can use the low end, we can expand into the room to really make the silent moment work. And then bang, we've got another one coming in, a really loud moment that's got a lot of aggression, and then there's humor still in there, that you make sure you get when then Ethan's talking back about where he's got off the edge of the cliff and all those things. So you kind of
get away from the mountain.
Yeah, exactly. So you're setting it up, and it's set up editorially, and then you're allowed to really play with it. They encourage it. There's a group of filmmakers.
The movie's been just an incredible ride up to that point. But I gotta say, I think I was the most tense when Ethan and Grace were racing through those cars as they're going off of the edge, and it was so refreshing to me. Like, in this day and age of like these huge, blockbuster action movies that just kind of end with a CGI mess. That particular part, you guys ended this movie by getting just tighter and tighter and tighter and more focused. And I felt like emotionally, it all came down to that little piece of metal that was holding that piano in place. So I love the way you guys pull this sequence off. And I want to give you just a chance to talk about maybe that chase through the train cars and how you approached the design and the mix on that particular part of the sequence. So
Grace introduces us to these carriages as she's running through, the kitchen and the thing. And so you go, oh, right, okay, there's a kitchen carriage. You get all this very early on, but the idea of a kitchen carriage, I'm sorry, but, with gas, with burning oil, with boiling, everything about it looks perilous. It's Buster Keaton on steroids, and actually, apart from the things that you don't see, which is the train vibrations and rattles and metal groans and the crumbling bricks and the bridge that is causing the train to continue to keep falling off, those things are out there. Everything else that we're playing with is as realistic as possible. You see a bottle fall down and you hear it land. And it's an effect we know, but it just seems to give the audience, Christ, it's 30 feet. You could hear it. You could tell it was far away because of the distance that it took for it to land, So you're just playing with what I call, hard effects, real effects. There's the design elements are the world that we're in shaking and moving. They recorded the piano. I'll let Chris talk about this, but the piano became a really big moment because it had to raise the jeopardy and the tension, but it had to do it in a way that wasn't musical. It was as a sound design thing as opposed to a musical thing. Yet this was Chris's moment where he was like, well, they're scoring at the moment. Isn't that right, Chris?
Yeah, as I said, I can't really take a lot of big applause for this sequence in the sense that the music was out and there's dialogue. There was some really, some pretty important dialogue later on, and fantastic, hilarious. Grace and Hayley Atwell, brilliant when she's trying to jump across in the piano scene. But we just asked for extra. They were still scoring while we were final mixing that sequence early on, and we just sent out the request, could they go and find the piano and start giving it a good old batter.
At Abbey Road. It was the Abbey Road. Oh no, it wasn't. It was
Abbey Road piano. It's quite a good request. I don't know if it's a Steinway or something, whatever they hit. Yeah, but the lids went up, so they really gave us a whole real lovely mixture of different sounds and low and high. Because again, McHugh and Tom wanted it to punctuate in a certain way, and it wanted to tell the story without being too dominant, because it, these long chords that you create, or these discordant sounds, can reverb on for quite a long time. So we created different shapes that punctuated, that allowed the dialogue to kick through and so on. But it gave us this really lovely extras, textures and so on. It was really very useful. So it's a nice sort of coming from the scoring stage, getting a nice sound effect. So there's a bit of luxury.
But also you get this weird thing when you're outside, the sound of the train crashing against the side of the bridge, or the coupling bolts, like literally that's the only sound you hear. It's like there's a bit of wind, and we strip everything away, so you just, oh no, it's more terrifying. I still think the running through the kitchen and sliding, and I mean it's just brilliant cinema. It's like you've got so much in that one carriage of humor, of jeopardy, of and the visual, the way these guys made it, from the construction of these things that were being dangled with Chunky, the camera operator, hanging in a harness upside down, trying to make sure that he was as close as possible to, we were there with the actors in this process, was from start to finish was extraordinary. And it just kept amping up as the cut refined, as we could start seeing what was happening outside, as the matting was coming in, and it was, and there were moments when they were like, well, should we try it without the kitchen scene, without the kitchen carriage? I'm like, no, got to try it. Let's have a look. Okay, no, we need it back, but we'll make it a bit shorter. That bit where he squashes the pepper with his foot, we don't need that. But it still works so brilliantly. It's still I think will remain a cinematic moment for a bit like when Tom dangles down on the long wire in the early Mission and he's suspended above the floor. I think it's one of those Mission Impossible classic scenes.
Like I said, I had the great experience of being able to see the movie back to back, first in 5.1 and then in Dolby Atmos. Night and day difference to the experience of watching the film. So we like to sometimes end this podcast by asking everybody, what was your favorite Dolby Atmos moment in the sound mix, the moment that really just kind of took off, and every time you see the movie kind of makes you smile and makes you happy? Who wants to lead off?
I'll just throw in a couple, but I think the desert battle and the sandstorm was an enormously challenging sequence to get right, but that absolutely delivers when you watch the movie now. It started off much longer, like 4 times longer. It was overstaying its welcome. We had to completely compress it. And then McHugh told us at the 11th hour, he's like, more bass. And it has to be this transformative moment sonically when the sandstorm comes in and when the characters are running around outside, and you just feel like you're standing by a kind of jet engine blowing sand at you, which is so satisfying. Not for too long, because otherwise it'd be tiring, but just to give you that immersive feeling. And there's a bit of music there that comes in. And the other thing I love about Dolby Atmos, just personally, is the immersive power of score when you have those full range speakers all around you. For me, that is the most impact that you can get out of a Dolby Atmos mix, is the intensity of the emotion from the music, which I absolutely love. especially, in the nightclub as well, when you've got the nightclub music, which Cecile Tornasak, our music editor, brilliantly mixed and cut, and then Chris mixed, obviously. But all those moments I love. There's one particular piece, like when Ethan and Gabriel are fighting in the train tunnel. I mean, Mark Taylor was just going nuts with the pan pots there, and he loves doing it, but he doesn't take any shortcuts. He really works on every tiny object to make sure that you're feeling everything moving through this. And then we did this trick when the train emerges from the tunnel. I remember this on the stage. Tom was like, I want to hear the air get like sucked out and then come back in afterwards, which is what would happen to your ears if you came out of a tunnel, where the air pressure changes. And Mark added like 2 frames of almost total silence on the sound, on the effects tracks, because we needed to get a kind of sound, and he got it just right. So when you feel Grace emerge from that tunnel, you feel your ears kind of go like that. It's so satisfying, and they nailed it there.
Well, while we're on that subject, let's finish it up. I'm so glad that Eddie brought that up, because my favorite Atmos moment in the mix is that fight scene in the train tunnel, because you guys really gave a sense of, like, I felt like the sound was right on top of my head. Like, it was really, I felt how tight that space was with the way you guys mixed that part of the track, for sure.
Yeah, it was. It was one of those scenes that very late on became a much different beast to the one that we had started with. We'd kind of followed the language of train tracks and carriage reflection sounds and squealing brakes on the walls of the thing, and very literal, and I sat there and just, hang on a minute. When you're standing underneath the Brooklyn Bridge and you're listening to the traffic going across, and you're hearing the tires wowing on the surface of the road, and that sound is not distinctive to anything. It's just, you just feel, what that sound. It's a roar all around you. And we went suddenly we're at a different angle. Right, I want the sounds of heavy traffic on bridges, underneath bridges, above bridges. I want trains on bridges, under bridges, so that you're recording it. You're getting the recording from beneath the sounds that you're using, and then turn them into 712, turn them into whatever Mark wants to play with. But there were tons and tons. It was one of the few instances where we just overloaded, because we wanted the sound to be so dense and with so many frequencies that you were just desperate to get away from it. And there's a weird thing that both Chris and I picked up on the first playback. All we played was the kind of background tracks, which is what I'm talking about, and all the whoosh bys and stuff were there, and they were always part of that process because they're visually so strong. But when you're listening to a density in a track like that, you hear voices, your brain picks up. It's like when you listen to pink noise, your brain is trying to decipher things within it that you make up. Your brain makes up. Did he make a noise then? No, dialogues are off. Did that? So it's really, it's all consuming, and your brain is frantically trying to work out what it's listening to and what the frequencies are trying to tell it. So I'm glad you liked it, because it was a very satisfying, none of us have been in that situation, so none of us know what it'd be like. Thankfully,
right? James and Chris, your favorite Dolby Atmos sound moments in the mix?
From my point of view, yes, it's quite a simple. In some ways, a simple aspect of something that evolved a little bit. We always wanted the Hummer Pom's vehicle in the car chase in Rome to just have super depth and danger. And again, it's the extra low end in the surrounds just allowed every time that to appear. Didn't need to be ridiculously loud, but there was just this impending sense of, Mark used a few plugins to just give an extra richness to the low end of that. And it always, when it arrives, it's just this lovely counterpoint to a lot of the other sounds in that sequence. So you just have this beautiful low end that just is immersive and all around you, and you just the joy of it, really. So that's a simple one that always makes me smile and excited and happy.
As a team of filmmakers, they have a really strong understanding, and this came out in Top Gun as well, a really strong understanding of the power of storytelling with sound. Affects as much as dialogue, the written word, obviously, the music, but the sound effects and sound design, and where you feature it, where you may not have fight sounds in one fight scene, you're going to have them later in a fight scene where the fight sounds matter. And so they have this ability, and it's the same with, why would you have a Fiat Cinquecento electric, virtually no sound effects on it at all, and a huge, great Hummer? And it's that understanding that the story will be so much better with those dynamic sounds opposing each other than if they were both in BMW, 3 Series or something else.
Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the film today. And we invoked him several times, but I do want to give a shout out to Chris, your companion, Mark Taylor, the effects mixer, who did just a brilliant job on the film, and unfortunately wasn't able to join us today for the conversation.
Well, I was just going to say, we actually, as a team, we've worked together now a few times, and we enjoy each other's company. There's quite a lot of pressure on a long film that has a lot of intense work, but we're a good team, and I hope everybody else feels that way. So I certainly do. I enjoy it.
I would say I'm not going to argue with success, between Top Gun and the previous missions and then coming into this one. And I'm certainly curious to see how you're going to raise the stakes for Dead Reckoning Part 2.
Start from the beginning.
No spoilers here.
We'll just start from the beginning.
Well, James, Chris, I really appreciate you taking the time on a Sunday to come and talk with us about the film. Congratulations on a great success. It's really an amazing.
Thank you for your praise. It means a lot. It's a lot to hear that from you, Glenn. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on, Glenn. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Glenn.
Many thanks once again to Eddie, James, and Chris for joining us in conversation today. And thanks to our friends at Paramount for setting this interview up for us. Go see the movie right now at a Dolby Cinema near you, where it's playing in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. It is a stunning experience. You'll find links to that in the show notes, as always. If you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, please make sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute Podcast. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you will find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, thanks again for joining us. This has been the Dolby Institute Podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. Thanks again for joining us.